Welcome, everyone. And I've been asked to tell those of us who are not in the room that we are recording. And this will be uploaded, but it will be uploaded only with my introduction of our lecturer today and with Allison Hammer's lecture. Just letting you know that. Thank you for your patience. This is an unusual time to start at a German university at the hour and not 15 minutes after the hour. My name is Greta Olson. I am a professor of American and British literary and cultural studies here at the University of Gießen. And today we are coming to you from the Center for Diversity, Media and Law, also at the University of Gießen. It has been our enormous pleasure to have Professor Hammer as a fellow here for the second time, and it is my pleasure now to introduce them. Allison Hammer is an associate professor and the coordinator in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Their monograph, Masculinity in Transition, was published in 2023 by the University of Minnesota Press and received the 2025 John, Leo, and Dana Heller Award for the Best Single Work, Anthology, Multi-Authored, or Edited Book in LGBTQ Studies from the National Popular Culture Association. Their work on queer and trans subjectivities and American cultural production is featured in a book published here, Diversity Issues in the USA, Transnational Perspectives on the 2024 Presidential Elections, in Queering Desire, Lesbians, Gender and Subjectivity, also 2024, The Routledge Companion to Art and Disability, 2022, in Utopian Studies, in the Transgender Studies Quarterly, in Women's Studies Quarterly, Frontiers, A Journey of Women's Studies, in Norma, the International Journey for Masculinity Studies, amongst other forums. Forthcoming works by Dr. Hammer include a chapter in a collection of essays on transmodernism by Edinburgh University Press, and another in an edited collection called Transmasculinity in Literature. They received a PhD in English literature with a certificate in women's and gender studies from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where they won the Monette Prize for Best Dissertation in LGBTQ+ Studies. Professor Hammer was also a faculty member at Vanderbilt University and Baruch College in New York City. They, and this is important given our current political moment, they introduced transgender studies both to Vanderbilt and at Southern Illinois University, and they aim to bring this subfield to new relevance across the disciplines. Since I had the pleasure of introducing Professor Hammer only about 10 days ago in another lecture, I just want to mention something today. And that is, since being at Carbondale, they have received 3 awards, also ones that are given by students. And that's just to speak for what their work does also for young people who are interested and invested in these topics. That is the University-wide Emerging Leader Award, sponsored by the University Chancellor of Southern Illinois in 2025. The Diversity Champion University Award, sponsored by the Vice Chancellor DEI at the Southern, again at Carbondale in 2024, plus the PRISM Award from the Paulette Corkin LGBTQ+ Center. Professor Hammer's concept that they discuss both in the book that I've just mentioned, as well as in another essay on exuberant transness, has been very helpful to us in when we published this book, thinking about how could we move forward in a time that looked politically dark, a moment that we inhabit now. The concept of unruly alliances is one that gives me hope. Unruly alliances may form in a variety of locations, on a factory floor, an urban neighborhood, a field hospital, or an isolated geographical location. They can be temporary, utilitarian, and with or without pathos. It is with that moment of hope in unruly alliances between all of us in a politically difficult time that it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Dr. Olson, for that beautiful introduction. So I am here to talk about the future of transmasculinity beyond the manosphere, and it's a lecture that I will be delivering in Berlin at Freie Universität on June 2nd. So you have a little preview of it now. In 1937, as fascism spread across Europe, Gertrude Stein wrote the following lamentation. Fathers are depressing. There is too much fathering going on just now, and there is no doubt about it, fathers are depressing. Everybody nowadays is a father. There is Father Mussolini and Father Hitler and Father Roosevelt and Father Stalin and Father Lewis and Father Bloom and Father Franco is just commencing now. And there are so many more ready to be one. Fathers are depressing. Stein was, of course, addressing the saturating androcentrism that marked her own time on the cusp of World War II as the world seemed to spin out of control. As I read this quote with all of its complications given Stein's conservatisms, I think of how she could not have anticipated the scale of what was coming. How the fathers would assume Europe and her beloved Paris. Similarly, today, the once fringe neo-fascist currents of today's manosphere have entered the mainstream against what many of us in gender and sexuality studies felt possible. But Stein's butchy smirk also tells me that we should not let toxic fathering paralyze us or stifle the bravado our moment requires. We need care and mutual aid. I have established that in Masculinity and Transition to fight the manosphere and its depressing cast of characters and plot lines. But what I'm calling butch bravado can also be widely accessible to a range of identities, genders, and sexualities. And here I define butch as a self-authorizing power, an artistic license not granted, but rather stolen and seized as part of a stylistic toolkit for any identity group. Butch disrupts the manosphere's gender-sex alignments, its white supremacy, and cisnormativity. White supremacist, Christian nationalist, anti-trans, and hypermasculine ideologies have already moved from insular online spaces into the mainstream. One case study is the martyrdom of Charlie Kirk, co-founder of Turning Point USA, assassinated on September 10, 2025 at Utah Valley University. Kirk instantly became a martyr for what Jamil Jaffer calls the far-right international. He was memorialized at the American Embassy in Berlin, AfD figures praising his resistance to migration and left-wing gender ideologies. For all of their anti-globalist rhetoric, the far-right is itself a global movement. Kirk is not an isolated case, and hypermasculine rhetoric echoes from the highest levels of the Trump administration. On September 30th, 2025, without explanation, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth recalled top military leaders from around the world for an unprecedented meeting. Hegseth claimed that the Department of Defense had a moment to protect U.S. cities using quick reaction forces to help quell so-called civil disturbances perpetrated by the so-called enemy from within. An executive order signed on September 22nd, 2025 would label as domestic terrorism any attempt to animate violent conduct through views deemed anti-American, anti-capitalist, or anti-Christian. The warrior ethos Hegseth promotes, the particular warrior ethos. The warrior ethos has been a part of the American military, by the way, prior to Hegseth. What he is promoting is something much more virulent. Makes the thesis of masculinity and transition even more prescient. In 2023, toxic masculinity had become so common that I proposed replacing toxic with normative to call attention to its ubiquity. This new normal of masculinity is shaped by the desire/demand for profit and for the psychological wages of dominance. However, its fragility is betrayed by its constant need for affirmation, the need to make a scene in the first place. For someone like Kirk, Trump was just the man's man that the moment requires, and he recruited young people into that ethos. So we're going to now, unfortunately, we're going to watch a clip. Let's pray for volume.
The cultural paradigm right now is a rebellion of the men of the West. It's happening in every major country, where young men are finding podcasts like ours. They're finding other, information conduits that believe in nature, believe in God's design, believe that men should have to stand up for the vulnerable, create a family, provide for the family, have to protect the weak, to fight the battles of society, to go on an adventure. It's very appealing to young men when they hear it. There's a lot that you can call Donald Trump. No one has ever called him feminine. Now, it wasn't even about policy. That's what people understand. That those partisan policy is like, no, he is the middle finger of all of the screeching hall monitors that have told me I have to use certain pronouns, that have told me that I'm bad for existing, that have penalized me for my existence. And Trump is the big F you to the feminist establishment that has not been challenged my entire life.
Kirk frequently blamed Black Lives Matter for the destruction of society and called for Nuremberg-style trials of doctors who provide gender-affirming care. He called on men to take care of trans people, quote, like they did in the 50s and 60s, end quote. He claimed there was, quote, a war on men. While the manosphere is hyper-visible and Kirk-style violence dominates, trans masculinity has been erased in the decades since Jack Halberstam wrote Female Masculinity, and that would be in 1998. While the manosphere cements masculinity to the assigned male body, to quote-unquote nature, the resignifications of masculinity from assigned female bodies are taken less seriously and or are subject to violence. The manosphere names the masculinity we live under, but masculinity has more productive forms. Trans people have resignified masculinity toward care and mutual aid, yes, but also toward butch, again, a productive and generative strength to combat these depressing fathers, and I would add sons.
The culture.
It is not surprising that as the manosphere careens out of control, there's an accompanying transmasculine invisibility in popular representation and in trans studies itself, suggesting a structural absence that needs correcting. I almost did not notice this absence, however, until I watched the 2023 film Mutt, the debut feature from writer-director Luc Lengeleuve-Klotz. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where the lead, Leo Mahil, won the Special Jury Award for acting. Set over a single chaotic day in New York City, the film follows Fenya, a young trans man in his mid-20s, as he navigates relationships and asserts the selfhood he has built. Lengeleuve review, which I want to credit my student August Helpling for alerting me to this interview, how he became motivated to fill this void. Quote, I never saw trans masculinity represented. I saw a lot of trans femininity. So I think this movie for me was like a deep, deep hunger to see me and us reflected back. And I just didn't feel sexy. When you don't see trans men falling in love on screen, you're just really sending a message. Clearly, this is an industry that has been dismissive of trans people more generally. Leo Mahil was the first trans person of any kind to win a Sundance Special Jury Acting Award. And in fact, it's rare to have both a trans director and a trans lead. But the dearth of trans masculinity is still notable. When asked why trans masculinity was erased, he referred to a conversation he had with Silas Howard, in which Howard explained very simply, I guess we weren't a trend. This interview really stunned me, and I can relate to the fan who told Lengeleuve-Klotz, quote, you healed something in me. Scholars in the field center trans femininity to the point where trans masculinity is no longer seen as important, and yet the focus is understandable, given that the anti-gender ideologies are hyper-focused on trans women. And then in the history of colonization, Europeans established gender norms through the expulsion and disciplining of trans feminized people. We're going to watch a clip of the film now that will kind of tie in what I've just said.
Thanks. So, I'm at my size and where I'm sure. So, we are in the beginning. Oh my God. No, sure. Right now. Yeah.
That gives you a feeling for the film. You'll have to watch it to get more, though. Moving on. Okay. So with this background in mind, trans historian Jules Gill Peterson states very definitively that, quote, trans femininity is an integral part of the social fabric. There will be no emancipation for anyone until we embrace trans femininity, centrality, and value. However, this does not mean that there is no value in studying trans masculinity. When a trans masc student expressed a desire for more theory and history of his experience, I realized that we have a problem. It is necessary to do both, to register and to study the historical and present day weight upon feminine presenting trans people who suffer from hypervisibility, and to bring attention back to Jack Halberstam's, quote, sneering tomboy, end quote. The problem deepens when we realize that with some exceptions, trans masc scholars who dominate the academy avoid writing about their own experiences. Gil Malatino does have one chapter dedicated to trans masculinity in his recent book, Side Effects, but in the introduction, which as those of you who've written academic books know is the most valuable real estate in a book, there's only a very literal parenthetical reference to masculinity. As Azura and Adair write in their article in TSQ, all the trans guys are just dating each other, quote, you laughed at that, transmasc sexuality has not been widely studied because it has historically been less of a social problem for cis people, whereas trans women in the trans misogynistic imagination are routinely hypersexualized and therefore have become the target of intensive pathologization. This erasure means there is no rigorous transmasculine rebuttal to the manosphere, but I'm going to change that. Okay. As Azura and Adair also point out, there may be a kind of guilt and shame in any vigorous embrace of the masculine. The dominant cultural figure of trans masculinity is, in their words, quote, buttoned down, bow-tied, and juvenile, end quote, what I would call the bow-tied eunuch, a masculinity that remains in the twilight of boyhood to avoid becoming Stein's depressing father figure. Violence is the violence of erasure. I want to promiscuously cross-apply an argument hermetically sealed in the vault of so-called lesbian criticism, Terry Castle's apparitional lesbian. In 1993, just as queer theory began to dominate, Castle argued that since the 18th century, the lesbian had been ghosted out of the cultural record and made into a phantom, precisely because she challenged patriarchal power relations. In cross-applying this claim, I want to be clear that I am not equating the lesbian with the transmasculine subject. I am not equating, yes, gender is now part of how we read butchness. However, despite its shortcomings, the apparitional lesbian helps us to realize that the transmasculine subject is not simply absent, they have been spectralized. While we cannot assume seamless continuity from butch lesbian to transmasculine, we cannot deny the relationship. Similarly, in cinema, the lesbian subject is subjected to a ghost effect through which she becomes, quote, elusive, vaporous, difficult to spot, even when she is there in plain view, end quote. The disruptive assigned female presence can only manifest through absence, something Castle calls recognition through negation. She writes, quote, the spectral figure is a perfect vehicle for conveying what must be called, though without a doubt paradoxically, that recognition through negation, which has taken place with regard to female homosexuality in Western culture since the Enlightenment. Nearly all of her examples, Olive Chancellor and Henry James's The Bostonian, Stephen Gordon and Stephen Hall's The Well of Loneliness, Matt and Duffy's The Microcosm, read on closer inspection as transmasculine longings as much as lesbian ones. We know now that the image of Greta Garbo's eponymous Queen Christina, who sleeps with the Spanish ambassador, could be transmasculine, queer, or lesbian all at the same time. Let me be direct. I am not just applying Castle's argument to an abstract subject. I am talking about myself here. As one of those middle-aged trans-mass scholars with a lesbian past, I am uniquely situated to identify the portability and the necessity of this structure of spectralization for all transmasculine people across the acronym. I can testify that the erasure that I have felt as a lesbian critic is nearly identical to what I experience as transmasculine. My masculinity is not taken seriously, just as my lesbian criticism was seen to be career ending. Literally, I was told that. I certainly got misgendered more often as a butch, and that felt really good, like a secret that I was savoring, like a cinnamon in my mouth that I was dissolving. However, as Castle contends, absence from discourse does not indicate a lack of importance. As Halberstam, Bobby Noble, and Castle remind us, the gender transgressions of assigned female people portend the end of the world for manospheres past and present. I worry that transmasculinity is being similarly subsumed into transfemininity when in lived experience they are different from each other. The phobias they trigger are distinct and must be analyzed both separately and together. We must attend to both hypervisibility and erasure. The Foucauldian substrate of power is, after all, always shifting. Okay. But it's true that the transmasculine subject has been ghosted than the butch was buried first. Recently, in conversation with a colleague, I spontaneously referred to a forgotten chapter of my past as occurring, quote, when I was a wee lad. This offhand remark had real significance as I began to ask, since the publication of my book, had I set aside masculinity to symbol that I am a, quote, good trans feminist, end quote. Masculinity outside of the male body, it seems, has always been subject to these kinds of double binds. In feminism, there has been a tendency to bury difficult parts of the past in favor of a glorious future. In a recent exchange with a trans mass student, I realized that young people desperately need access to the histories of butch, female masculinity, and trans masculinity for their own identity work, especially those histories of grievances that tell us just how we move through the impasses. The butch has been an overdetermined figure, always an outsider, and butch history is what I felt I needed to jettison in order to enter transmasculinity. Betrayal itself, as Halberstam shows in Queer Art of Failure, is an oppositional resource I can take with me. For the present, I am offering butchness as a betrayal of the oozing normativity of the manosphere. The history of grievance helps explain these deep fractures. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing into the 1980s, cultural feminists and lesbian separatists expelled butches and femmes for their supposed aping of heteronormativity. Femaleness became inherent and immutable, and masculine identification became false consciousness. As Sharon Dale Stone remembers, cultural feminism and lesbian separatism, quote, dictated that any lesbian worthy of the label didn't even think that men were human. Yvonne Yarbrough Bejarano recalls how, quote, penetration, butch, femme, or S&M erotic stylings of images of the domination, control, and violence were taboo. A new sexual purity demanded the burial of butch. The normalizing image of the trans-masked bow-tied eunuch, it seems, just may be an incarnation of what Ansel Dua identified as the cerebral white middle-class Anglophone lesbian. Ansel Dua preferred queer to lesbian for that reason, and in fact, lesbians of color, butches, and femmes of color found a new home in the queer nation of the 1990s. However, to be clear, Ansel Dua's critique is not the cultural feminist or the TERF critique. She refused lesbian as a narrow white category, not butchness or female masculinity. As Kathy Cohen formalized in Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, it was, quote, one's relation to power and not some homogenized identity that became the oppositional glue. Sure. Queer had become what Castle feared, a generic category absorbing butch identity wholesale, fueling the butch flight myth. The story goes that butches were now fleeing their femininity and joining in with gay men, what Halberstam diagnosed in 1998 as the butch FTM border wars. To bury your butches in this period meant to disown a butch male-identified sexuality in favor of a female-identified and whitened lesbian identity that could stand up to queer nation. Radical feminists who are trans exclusionary now argue, ironically, that women should be able to present as masculine and still be women. As Azura and Adair convey, these quote unquote TERFs stoke fears about the online spread of the now discredited rapid onset gender dysphoria construct, which is stealing away our daughters. In our moment, we are witnessing a convenient revisionist history in which the barrier butch's gesture is being revived through a trans panic and a forgetting of queer as a way to discipline transmasculine people. Reciting this history is a chance to rid myself of feminist and trans feminist guilt. And further, there are bigger monsters at our door. As Cohen argues, the collapse of queer into personal identity has created a new opacity of positionality, obscuring the workings of power. Moral purity does not help to answer the question, how do the masculine identified avoid the normativity of the manosphere? And in reclaiming butch, I'm not just reclaiming it for my career, but for my art, my sexuality, and my experience of the world, that I am publicly expressing now that I'm tired of hiding behind the apologies that have become so commonplace. How do I desire masculinity for myself and claim my past as a wee lad, continuing with Miraga's project of reworking the Chingada dichotomy? This is butchness as sexy, cheeky, and with a throw of the hip, a power turned against, not toward, the depressing fathers. This is not a plea for return to butch's identity, but a return to the no man's land where butch has always lived, the space between female masculinity and assigned male masculinity, where Bobby Noble locates trans masculinity in its most potent and oppositional form. So against the histories of grievance that we've just rehearsed, butch and trans masculinity are not separable. They are not at war. Rather, the incoherence between them is the productive political space in which butchness as sensibility can and should live. The closest scholarly precedent is Bobby Noble's No Man's Land, which he explores in Sons of the Movement in 2006. Sorry, one second. I lean into Noble's call for a no man's land, occupied by all of the masculine identified figurations buried by feminist orthodoxies. Noble discovers here a resonance between female and trans masculinity as, quote, dependent traces of one another, end quote, rather than as separate identities. Further, trans butch suggests the dismantling of the trans butch border in service of trans masculine and butch solidarity. My use of butch, which is going to be the title of my next book, I'm going to explain that in a minute, is more broad and argues for butch as a transferable style across identity groups, including beyond the trans butch access for confronting the manosphere. After Chris Kaufman, I used trans masculinity more expansively to refer to a broad range of masculine traits in persons assigned female at birth, encompassing what Halberstam calls female masculinity, but also those who consider themselves transgender or transsexual, which is a more dated term. Butchness, a playful variation of butch, also resists turf-free incorporation as it becomes widely usable. This is not butch as heroic dysphoria invoked to shame transmasculine subjects, but a flavoring that can disrupt masculine hegemony. As Kavar contends, essentialist socialization should be replaced with experience, which is historically situated, narratively held, and transferable. In this spirit, Esper Bergman self-names as a trans man of butch experience who is married to a faggot of faggot experience. Butchness is a necessary inflection and mood in this age of the manosphere, and in this no man's land, Castle's call for the specific over the generic now extends to include incoherence as a political style. In the space of incoherence and as a sensibility, rather than as an identity, I claim butch as a constellation, more of a constellation than a continuum. As Matt Fournier argues, continuum applies a progression that butch as unruly modifier eschews. Constellation is multidimensional and accommodates simultaneity of butch experience. Butchness in my rendering is not something one possesses to a greater or lesser degree. However, as useful as Bergman's phrase butch experience might be, I don't want to bypass the reality of white trans masculinity as highly recruitable for the manosphere. While I depart from Halberstam's continuum model, preferring constellation, I want to follow his lead in the chapter, The Killer in Me is the Killer in You. Queer masculinity's complicity with fascism must be confronted, but in a way that diminishes the need for any purification of the past or present, itself a fascist tendency. For Halberstam, the erasure of the fascist masculine gay man indicates an unwillingness to grapple with difficult historical antecedents. He insists that betrayal and disloyalty are part of the oppositional arsenal and purity is a dangerous myth. As Noble insists, transmass subjects often dwell in the belly of the beast as they move in and out of male-identified spaces. And I've argued also in Masculinity Transition about the intersection of whiteness and masculinity. That is always a problem. That is always something to consider when thinking about masculinity. Okay, so I want to show you these photos I took of myself on the beach a few weeks ago. One of the first times that I was shirtless in public. Ironically, perhaps an American audience won't get this, but I was in Mallorca, which is sort of like the Jersey of Spain. Was not the most comfortable place to be a full-chested trans math person, but nonetheless, I walked myself down to where the nudists were, and that actually was very helpful. It was sort of a quiet space to think about what returning to these scholarly sources means to me. And I consider how the stars, which I often wish weren't there, are the palimpsest of my body as I moved from assigned female to non-binary and now to transmasc, though those things overlap. And I want to think carefully about chess reconstruction, going back to Mutt, as a site where transmasc scholars meet the limits of available language and politics. In Brilliant Imperfection, Eli Clare theorizes desiring a flat chest alongside living with disability. Both require rejecting the classificatory systems of the DSM, TERFs, we can nuance that, and the Manosphere. For Noble, the nipple graft becomes a powerful metaphor for identity work and the layering that comprises the self. Noble writes, quote, "This is the same chest, the same body, the same flesh I've always known, only now its text is totally different." The process of using the existing nipple in chest reconstruction symbolizes for me how in becoming transmasc and entering the no man's land themselves. Okay. The bow-tied eunuch, the image of the transmasc that predominates, should be called transnormative, yes, but this isn't sufficient. We need to ask why it exists. On the one hand, it shows how transmasc must be defanged and desexed to satisfy both feminist androphobe and the manosphere. There is a demand to choose the right way to be transmasc, but sexuality is complicated. If we police every desire, then the mystery and the power of sexual is gone. So kind of take to, but very think about something that healthy, I'm not sure is the right word. Let me just put it that way. There is a distinct playful masculine dominance and normativity. So-called masculinity, what we claim to want, can be collected with data, which to what doctors call the new misogyny. However, shutting down has the consequence of stifling power. Hilmaltino against transpositivity in the style of the actual. Calling Williams Mullen's alternate transnormations of feeling the ground hegemonic trans narratives and images. For Malatino, we do this to ourselves pre-accusation that we're envying or aping cis men.
Slower.
Absolutely, yep.
Non-English.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I just lost my place temporarily with the wind blowing around. There we go. Okay. The accusation of aping brings us again back to butch and to butch sexual power as its own lost archive. I want to turn back to Yarbrough Bejarano's writing on Sheri Moraga, which I was wrestling with along with my own grafted identity. For me, the desire to be phallic, for example, is something that one needs to, bring into the present of transmasculinity. As Moraga wrote, quote, "I long to enter you like a temple," end quote. She resignified both phallic penetration and receptivity, the phallic becoming about butch skill in making love to a woman in the parlance of the time, receptivity becoming the active power of the femme. After all, quote, "hands as non-orgasmic penetrators," end quote, is a phrase that has traction for many of us in the no man's land. I remember being so moved by this older butch femme stuff, and yet at the time, it wasn't something that I was really accessing. So we've also thankfully moved on in the sexual discourse away from assumed attraction to cis women, paving the way toward this more expansive understanding of butch that I'm offering. In the article mentioned earlier of Erasure and Adair, they use T for T, mask for mask erotics as a way to dispel the now discredited phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. In their view, the daddy-boy dynamic in transsexual subcultures is another kind of gender labor, indicating the range of pedagogical fantasies that produce masculinity. And in conversation with the republished Diaries of Lou Sullivan, Azura and Adair significantly expand the transmasc sexual territory available for this recovery work. And butchness, the swagger, the throw of the hip, is part of that recovery work. The unruly alliances that I proposed in Masculinity and Transition are the stuff of coalitional building, which for LGBTQ plus people has included the right to our sexualities, to have our bodies and our desires depathologized. In unruly alliances, differences in that expression are fuel to fight the manosphere. Butch is one adhesive that unites us as it brings us back to our bodies, the body being that palimpsest again, and the layers going back further than my own scars. And that's the archive that I want to open. This is just, okay. So now moving on to the Butch archive. These are 9 portraits of the assigned female artist that I was dealing with in my dissertation work from 2017. And the dissertation was called Butch Between the Wars. None of them called themselves Butch, and most of them died before Butch had even become an identity for lesbians in the 1940s and 50s. I want to focus on one in particular, and that is Ma Rainey. Ma Rainey was a blues artist who used Butch style as a multi-layered response to sexism, racism, and homophobia. She used Butch defiance and rage to confront the legacy of enslavement and Jim Crow. Tell It Like It Is suggests the contours of a Butch style determined by life or death, racial, economic, and social factors. Rainey embraced the earlier Butch identity, the bull dagger or the beady woman. Beady blues between the wars transgressed binaries of all kinds, male, female, straight, gay, rural, urban, further demonstrating how blues, more generally speaking, escapes definition. Ma Rainey transformed herself into a masculine wanderer and philanderer, claiming the musical styles of the Black bluesmen by performing for larger audiences, both in the North and South, and making 92 records, 92 in 5 years under the Paramount label. She also stole the white male privilege of being seen and heard. Rainey was also outraged in her choice of dress and lifestyle, even by today's standards. And I theorize this outrageousness as an expression of outrage. The protests of the beady woman paved the way for later Black feminist thinkers, as well as the civil rights era more broadly defined. And this is the history as method that I am utilizing in this project. As Audre Lorde wrote, quote, focused with precision, anger can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. Anger is loaded with information and energy. So we need space to cry in the United States. My students can attest to that. But we also need room to be outraged. We need language to be outraged. Butch-styled writers, musicians, performers, and actors possess an agency that, in Judith Butler's words, quote, exceeds the power by which it is enabled, end quote. They become artists working against the grain, necessary subjects for study in the moment. They are anomalies of exceptions, agitators, whose artistic products are results of what Hannah Arendt calls the unpredictable outcome of acting in the world. Butch is a style that moves discreetly and overtly, weaving its way through diverse identity categories. So my plan here is to develop the concept of unruly alliances from masculinity and transition, while shifting the focus back to Butch as a transferable stylistic toolkit that responds to the rise of what Olson and Kreitler call transnational Trumpism. So Butch should become a widely usable term for any identity group to access courage and strength to fight the manosphere. Identity arguments collapse under the question, who's Butch? But style arguments are by definition portable, citational, and learnable. Butch behaviors, cited by queer Butch anthropologist S. Lachlan Jane, become the stuff of style. Quote, jocularity, physical strength, confidence, straight talking, space taking. Lisa Cohen, a biographer of artistic women in the 1920s, adds that style is, quote, a response to the terror of invisibility. and isolation. A wish for inclusion. Above all, it is a productive act that, although it concerns itself with the creation and experience of brilliant surfaces, is powerful because it unsettles what we think we know about the superficial and the profound. Butch's style offers meanings that stray from the more predictable stereotypes as it pulls from the past in unanticipated ways. When butch becomes adaptable and adoptable, we are taking seriously Kathy Cohen's vision for a politics in which, quote, one's relation to power and not some homogenized identity is privileged in determining one's political comrades, end quote. And thinking with Kavar, style connects anyone of butch experience, crucially though, based on their marginalization in relation to power. The term trans butch is instructive here. As Kavar writes, it names, quote, an ongoing historical journey as well as a political practice. It allows us continuity with our young selves and future selves. So earlier this year, when I wanted to bring back this work, The Bravado of Butch, I felt I needed to return to its boldness, which, can be sticky ground. I think it's productive. I think it's interesting. I think it goes beyond the platitudes of care and mutual aid towards something that can sort of weave the strands, so to speak. And it expresses trans masculinity's potentiality in the present, which I think is horribly overlooked in the present. All of us who are assigned female who cross over into masculinity, whether that is attitude, dress, or embodiment, we go through so much to get to our own strength. And all the while, every step of the way, being disciplined and told that it's wrong. So it wasn't as the fire of butch that drew me in, bravado identifying what I say is this missing ingredient, what has been obscured in the bow-tied eunuch image of trans masculinity. So do not hold me to this, but this is a playful thing. Okay. In the next book, Butch Period, I want to carry this understanding of Butch's style from the first election of Trump when I began. So I had my dissertation defended during the first Trump, y'all. Okay. To now the second election of Trump and the acceleration of the manosphere, the acceleration of normative masculine violence, which I said in the conclusion to Masculinity and Transition, sometimes it is not fun to be right. It is putting the entire world in danger once again. And after bell hooks, I used Butch Period to refuse proprietary self-naming. The period turns Butch into a declarative, a full stop, a claim that revels in Arendt speaking as action. We need Butch back, in short. Okay. Charlie Kirk's death was mourned in Berlin in front of the American embassy by a far-right party that is a slant rhyme to the Republicans in the US who continue to destroy the lives of people who do not fit in with the white Christian nationalist ethos. The mourning of Kirk by the AfD is an invitation to a future that closely resembles our present. My next book, Butch, will unequivocally decline that invitation. In 1937, Stein warned of too much fathering, and while the fathers came anyway, she kept writing. And that persistence is what is needed. By releasing our expectations of how gender should signify, both historically and in the present, we can cultivate a kind of trust, which will allow us to listen more attentively, more astutely to new vocabularies, furthering our aesthetic education as a kind of political act. This is what I mean by Butch, a way of being in the world in which individuals maintain a fierce demand for truth. We can cross-pollinate, acknowledge both our categories and our complications, and use our energies to dismiss, under any circumstance and with a Butch throw of the hip, the alternative fact, no matter how seductive it may appear. Thank you.